modern society where men and women are viewed equally capable of holding high leadership positions, as it is essential also to create gender equality in our workplace too. But in reality, lack of women on senior roles is becoming a concern for many sectors. Joining me, Em Roblin from Canada, who is for over 15 years has been creating experience that empower people to grow. She has coached more than 200 women leaders and worked with number of top Fortune 500 companies. She is here to share her perspective on gender disparity, diversity, inclusion across the world. So hi, Em, we welcome you on our channel. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me. I just want to say before we start, it's been so lovely getting to know you and learning more about some of the really cool initiatives that you've been running. It's really inspiring. So thank you for that and for having me here to share. I'm delighted to be here.
It is indeed our pleasure, Em. So Em, let me start with my first question, which I feel is very, very important for all women entrepreneurs and in a society where we are living in a lot of gender diversity, inclusion, and these things are being taught. But on ground level, reality is something else. So my first question to you, what do you think are some of the biggest challenges or obstacles a woman face in being able to enjoy career success?
Yeah, it's a really big question, and I thank you for pointing out as well that there are many women entrepreneurs tuning in here. I think that's also a whole other element. You know, I am an entrepreneur myself. I've been running my own firm for more than 10 years.
Wonderful.
And yeah, starting my own company in my late 20s, in another country than my native country of Canada. So I started running a business out of Hong Kong, and I served Greater China, so mainland China, also Singapore. So these were markets outside of my home market. Also being a young woman, and also building up. It was also the stage of my career where I was building my expertise. I was challenged a lot. I'm speaking just from my personal experience first. I was challenged a lot intuitively. I always knew in my business that I needed to be able to serve different industries to do what I do. So, you know, my vision is to really build an inclusive world where people are able to live out their uniqueness and everybody has the space to, you know, develop their individual potential. So I knew early on, even though, you know, and we can talk about this later about inclusion and diversity, it was the tech companies at first that really started to work with me, because technology companies tended to get earlier on the benefits of having women in leadership, and they also had challenges around that. And they could see that, you know, inclusion, when we have a diverse work environment and we have an inclusive environment, we're actually going to be more innovative. And of course, for technology, innovation and technology are like so closely linked. Yes. But back to my story about the challenges that women face, it was always intuitive to me that I needed to work across sectors. Because if I only worked with the technology sector, then I would over time I would become an insider in the technology space, and I would start to talk the insider technology language. Right. And then I wouldn't be able to help people understand their blind spots and create the more inclusive space that we needed to create. Right. A big part of building an inclusive environment is being able, in a very nuanced and compassionate way, to help people see their blind spots. Because in my experience, most people really don't have any conscious recognition of like, I only want men to be successful in business. Like most people, women and men that I have worked with, and I have worked with thousands of people inside organizations. I've worked with 200 women very, very, very closely over the last few years. But in my work with organizations, it's very rare for me to find somebody that doesn't want to see the people around them thrive. And I think that's a really important thing to point out. So it's not like, you know, as women necessarily we are facing, we are facing in some cases very overt sexism and discrimination. Okay.
Right.
And in certain countries and cultures and industries, it's more serious than others. But even in like the technology space where there's a lot of effort being made, and again, as a younger woman myself, running a business in places where I was encouraged to do that, I still was constantly challenged. So even though I had this intuition, like I know I need to work with different industries, when I would go and sit with a manufacturing organization or a law firm or I don't know, a public relations agency or a communications agency, they would look at some of my clients and be like, why are you here? You should be working with the technology sector. You've already worked with tech companies. And my intuition would say, actually, you know what? To do this work, it's so much more better. It's so much better for me to function like a consultant, to be able to call you out, pull you outside of the box. And I was constantly challenged to the point where like I started to question myself, you know, even though I had this deep knowing, I started to question my own judgment.
Right.
I started to question my own decision making.
Okay.
And this is something I have heard time and time again from women who get questioned very frequently, get challenged very frequently in the stuff that actually, there are many things that I know that I don't know, okay? And then there's some things, very few, that I actually know that I know. And to be consistently challenged on the things that I know starts to create this, I don't want to call it a confidence gap, because there's still a deep knowing, but it does cause this this questioning. And I have met so many women, whether they're entrepreneurs and they're seeking investment and they're just getting challenged trying to raise that level, that round of funding that they really need to grow and scale their business. They keep getting challenged and keep getting questioned. And then it starts to really take its toll, and we start to challenge ourselves, and it becomes self-destructive. But I've seen it as well in really big organizations. You know, how it's kind of sad if you think about it. A woman who has worked very hard for I'm just using an example of one of my clients, you know, worked really hard for 10 to 12 years. And she's put in a lot of career effort, and she's, you know, got an expertise in her career, and she's being recognized for that. And then she has her first child, and she's, you know, adjusting to motherhood and the challenges and pressure around that. And then she's back at work. And it's like, this is the moment in her life that she's worked for and prepared for. And it's what a celebratory, beautiful time in life. Yet so many of the women I work with, they actually feel at the lowest point in their lives after they've had their children and they're trying to get back into work. Right. And they actually feel that same pattern of like low confidence, despite the fact that they are experts in what they do and they've just brought a child into the world, like a healthy child, and it's a blessing and a beautiful thing. Yet we've, because we've been challenged in a very subtle way, the way our organizations have been set up, we're feeling low confidence, and it causes like a downward spiral from there.
Yes.
This is just one example. You know, I think it's amazing to see, you know, especially with what's going on right now. Let's talk about the pandemic, where work is being reinvented. I think we are seeing some of the challenges of the double burden that women have been carrying for a long time, where now, you know, we're working from home, and then there's all the family responsibilities in addition to the work responsibilities, and we see the impact it's having disproportionately on some, the people who carry the load of the family and are, you know, required to be professionals as well as school teachers, as well as, you know, continuing to take care of the household. We're starting to see the disparity of how this really looks in this new era. And I know, you know, we're today focusing on gender, and I think, you know, there's an important concept that I should also just bring up, which is the intersectionality, that you know, there's being a woman, there's being a woman from which, you know, which race or which country or which community or which caste, or all of these things is really important to recognize the intersectionality that makes each of us very unique. So while I started by describing just like one of the challenges that I faced, I also recognize that as a white, well-educated woman from Canada, I also carry a lot of privilege as well. And again, a lot of this inclusion and diversity work is about recognizing the subtleties of how do we create a more inclusive environment. And that includes recognizing where I hold privilege and where also I do not, and to understand those nuances. So for a lot of women, it's on the one hand about understanding, like, I'm not alone in this challenge of trying to thrive as myself in an organization or in a career that has traditionally been dominated by men. And so I feel a little bit like I'm trying really hard to fit in. Sometimes women can feel alone. So it's important on the one hand to remember that as women, like, we are sisters and we're all facing these similar challenges. Yeah. And on the other hand, it's also important to recognize individually who we are and how we are unique, and how that uniqueness also carries a lot of power. And in my case, it has been about, you know, carrying the privileges that I have as a white woman operating in a global landscape based out of Asia for a long time. It's also about bringing the spotlight and bringing the focus to, in my case, mostly in mainland China, helping these global organizations to see the amazing talent that the women inside their organizations in China hold, and to help those women get the spotlight. And that's part of privilege, which is about extending a hand and pulling people up with us.
Right. So moving on to my next question, which is about the recent times, as we see that many organizations are actively addressing such issues like, you know, gender equality or this kind of disparity. So from an organization point of view, why do you feel it is crucial to address such problems, and inclusion and diversity is more important to them?
Yeah, there are so many reasons. I mean, let's start with like the most basic, which is talent. Okay, so if I'm an organization and I want to recruit talent, well, the talent pool is diverse, right? So I mean, when you look at the not just by generation and age and like and skill, competency, but language, all of those things, like the talent market, if I want to be able to really recruit the best talent, I also need to recognize that not everybody is the same. So if we want the best talent, if we want to be able to compete for the best talent, we need to understand and recognize that that talent is diverse. That's like, maybe, you know, and the talent markets are shifting. Right? Because we have aging populations. So the demographics of many countries, especially in Asia, are changing very quickly. And so if a company wants to continue, or just access that top talent, that's one strategy that's super important. But, you know, diversity, or let's call it inclusion, diversity or inclusion. And let me be careful to make the distinction between the two of those things, because diversity is about the mix of the talent. And so while, gender is one part of diversity, and many companies use gender to measure and track how they're doing around diversity. And I mean, there still are some complexities around gender, right? As we know, we've got transgender and cisgender, and we're having conversations around that globally. But in most countries around the world, gender, it's legal to actually like track. And so for big global organizations too, gender is a really good way to actually like, it's like taking a cross section and then we can apply it to other parts of diversity. So for example, if a company has gender diversity, well, then if they don't have any gender diversity, they probably don't also have other kinds of diversity, whether it's cultural diversity. Generation or age is another one that's kind of easy to track. So when we talk about diversity, we're talking about the mix of talent.
Geographical diversities or, demographic diversities, different sort of diversity.
Well,
broader
diversity, if we really integrate that concept of intersectionality, actually, like, we can look at diversity from a lot of different perspectives, even from like education level, language, like all of those things that come together. And so many companies many years ago thought, well, okay, we need diversity, so diversity actually as a problem is pretty easy to solve if you think about it. Okay, we have no women, let's go and hire some women. And that's exactly what companies did at one point. This was like, that solves the diversity problem, because diversity is something that's quite easy to measure. But then there's inclusion. So for many years, it was, when I would talk to companies, we would call this D&I, like diversity and inclusion. But in the last several years, we've started to invert it. We call it inclusion and diversity, I and D. You notice the switch, because the inclusion is the culture. It's the, is there an environment where that diversity can exist? And actually what many companies found is you can't just hire diversity in if the company doesn't have the culture or the environment where different opinions are allowed to be voiced and can coexist, then the diversity doesn't work. And that's why in many companies, they would go through these phases of hiring external senior women into the organization. And then those women would last for 6 to 12 months. And then they would leave, because even they are diverse, their voice isn't welcomed or accepted. And so that's the inclusion perspective that's so important. So back to your question around like, why would a company want this inclusive and diverse perspective? One is because we want the best talent. Number two is, if we want to succeed in a competitive market, then we need to be innovative. So unless we're working in like very much a purely execution, follow directions kind of environment where it's just, I say, you do, which is, there was an era, the kind of like industrial era was sort of built around that frame of thinking. In that kind of an era, you don't really need a ton of critical thinking or innovation. It's more just efficiency and execution. But in the era that we live in today, the only way to gain a competitive edge in most industries and in most markets is to be innovative. And we know that innovation comes from the more diversity that you have in a group, the smaller your collective blind spot, if that makes sense. If you think about it, if you hire a bunch of people on a team that are all very similar in their life experience, in their education background, they actually see the world in a very similar way. We all share the same collective blind spot. But the more we have different people working together, we have a more, our blind spots help cancel each other out, and we're able to get a fuller picture. And that allows us as a team to be able to create more innovative solutions. So I would say, in my experience, that companies that are the best in inclusion and diversity, they're motivated from that competitive market edge innovation lens, And I'd say the companies that are more starting out on this journey, they do it, the benefits that they seek are more like to avoid risk. Because of course, if you don't diversify and seek to build inclusion, because of that collective blind spot, you're really opening yourself up to a lot of liabilities. We see that right now in this era in every direction. It's like almost every day there's some sort of public relations nightmare. And so I'd say that would be like the least benefit, you know, but there's still real benefit there. And I don't judge companies.
Yeah.
No, like let's be honest about the motivation, but let's start the conversation. So some of my clients are doing this to mitigate risk. And then there's this one last thing that I'll just talk about, which is the employer branding, right? Which is back to this fight for talent. But it's even shown that people that work in an inclusive environment, they're so much more engaged at work. And engagement is also a soft concept, but engaged, they get sick less, they stay at the company longer, they're proud of working at the organization. And these are people that are like all employees report this, not just the employees that are classified as diverse in some way. And so and more with the changing demographics, people are seeking that. They're seeking a place where they feel belonging, and the belonging comes in the inclusive environment. And so from it used to be, and some companies still do this, that inclusion and diversity gets put under human resources as like this is a human resources thing, because again, we want to mitigate risk and make our place of work an important, or a nice place to work. But there are many other companies that actually set up a whole other unit for inclusion and diversity. And these are the companies, like the technology companies, that really see inclusion and diversity as a business strategy to break through into new markets and innovate in existing markets as well. And so, yeah.
Question to you is, if you could share with us some practical tools to be more inclusive and help women and those around her to rise. Are there some tools you feel in your experience, probably you might have implemented in your life too? So that would be quite insightful learning.
Yes. Yeah, thank you for asking me this question, because we're talking about challenges, and then we're talking about the benefits to an organization, but ultimately, it's about like what whoever's listening, it's like, what can I actually do like right now to be more inclusive, to support people around me. I think if we're just talking about ourselves first, it's we need to be infinitely curious, especially about people, to challenge our assumptions about people and about ourselves. Because the fact is, as human beings, right, we the way that our brains work is that we form judgments and make decisions based on our previous experience, and it happens so naturally. And we do this with people, and so we have blind spots. And so this is the point back to, I've really not met that many leaders that don't want to be super supportive. The challenge is they only go through the world as themselves, and so they don't really understand what it's like. Let me just give you a really simple example around this, around how the blind spots play out in real time. So I've had this show up in so many leadership development programs, where you'll look at a top leader, maybe in Hong Kong or in Singapore, running the region for a big multinational company. And we're talking about being inclusive. And they're like, I'm so inclusive. I'm already so inclusive. I don't even have a door, or maybe I don't even have a wall, because many organizations work in this more co-working kind of space, open environment. So a lot of these leaders will say, well, you can't get more inclusive than me. I don't even have a door in my office. So I ask these guys, okay, take out guys, because it's almost always these people in these positions are men, not necessarily, but usually. And I'll ask them to take out a piece of paper and just write down the last 5 people that just dropped in to their office.
Okay.
And usually it's like, oh, we start to notice that the people who are dropping into the office are people that are not the most diverse. They're people that are similar to those people. And so I tell the story about a young, and there's many, but about, you know, the young woman who works in the cubicle down the hall, and I dare her, you know, I like a dare, you know, she's like a individual contributor, but labeled or identified as a high potential in the organization. I dare her, walk down the hall and just pop in to your managing director's office. And she's like, what? I could never do that. It's like, what? And I described this to the leader, how traumatized, how scary and intimidating it is for her. And they're like, what? Like, what do you mean it's hard for her? Like, because they can't see themselves as anything but approachable and friendly. But for her, it's like she could do it because she's very professional and she's very committed to her job. But it would need to be like a very important emergency for her to really feel the need to walk down the hall and knock on his door. And so I share that because it's like, as a leader, so this is something where we need to be infinitely curious about ourselves, that just because we see ourselves in one way does not mean that we don't hold really important blind spots. Yeah. And so this is also true about other people. We need to stay curious. And so as a colleague or a manager, it's important to ask open-ended questions and to become really comfortable asking open-ended questions to our colleagues. So what's an example of an open-ended question? Just give you one quick example too. It's about, that really relates to gender, is about women around anything to do with maternity, right? So maybe somebody in your team is pregnant. And so what many managers do, who are very caring, lovely managers, you know, they start to make assumptions that this pregnant woman on the team won't want to be part of projects, or won't want to travel, or won't want to do things because she's pregnant. And by the way, if she's pregnant and she doesn't want to take on a whole bunch of extra things, that's very much her right. And it's important to have a discussion about it, because a lot of times what people do is they make assumptions, assuming what's best for her. But this is exactly why we need to have open conversations. And that's just a simple example about pregnancy. What if she wants the new project? What if she feels like she can take it on?
And finally, what is your message to all women entrepreneurs who are watching
you? Yeah, well, my message to all women entrepreneurs is just keep going. Absolutely, keep going. But I want to say one last tip too about this. What can you do to make sure you're going to be successful and integrate this inclusion and diversity into your life? Just like any really big company has a board, right? If you think about a board brings together people with diverse, a good board brings together people with diverse backgrounds, not just to play very different roles. We need to have somebody that has a finance background. We need to have somebody that has a strategy background. We need to have somebody that has industry experience. We need to do the same thing for ourselves. Even if your business isn't at a stage where it needs a full intact board, put together a personal board of directors. Make sure in your personal board of directors that you've got that diversity, because oftentimes, unchecked, the people we end up calling out to for help are people that are very similar to us. So when we go and seek advice, the people we tend to be comfortable with are people who are quite similar to us. And that's going to limit that power of the diversity. And so you have to be intentional to craft and create that kind of personal board. but make sure that you're doing that. That's a tip to certainly be successful. Don't give up. And that goes for you too, Rajni. I love what you're doing.
Thank you so much, Em. Thank you so much for being with us, and thank you so much for sharing your perspective. And it's been lovely and insightful talking with you. Thank you so much once again for your time. Thank you guys for watching. Take care and bye.